I would like to examine this week's Parsha, and I did not attach a source sheet this time. During this whole series of Live with Rav Meir, I've been making a concerted effort to not just rehash things which I've been teaching over the past 30 years, but to try to come to it from a fresh angle. And as I've been doing this, I actually come up with new ideas. So most of the things which I'm going to be discussing tonight are really my ideas, and here and there where I have certain commentaries that I'll refer to, I'll mention them, but I don't necessarily have any particular commentary that I will be focusing on this evening. So without any further ado, this week's Parsha is Parashat Tetzaveh. Generally, when people hear the Tetzaveh, the thing which immediately comes to mind are the priestly garments. And that's really seen as being the core of this week's Parsha. So I just want to begin by saying I probably will not be speaking about the priestly garments. And in fact, what I'm going to be looking at is the overall structure of the Parsha, and to try to see, to explain somehow why it is actually structured the way it is and what are the ideas behind it. So if you can follow with me now, let's just look at a general outline of the Parsha. And so the Parsha begins in chapter 27, verse 20. And in fact, if you look at the first two verses of the Parsha, you'll see that the topic is the lighting of the menorah that was done in the tabernacle, in the temple, on a daily basis. And again, I'm going to speak in very, very general terms, and eventually we're going to come back and look at certain things in more detail. So that's the opening section, two verses that speak about the lighting of the menorah. Then I get to chapter 28. And for those of you who are quick readers, so you'll see it, and not, you'll just take my word on it. Chapter 28, the whole chapter, has to do with the priestly garments. And that's why, as I said in the beginning, most people associate this Parsha with the priestly garments because of this chapter, which is seen as being, as I said, the centerpiece of the Parsha. But if I now move along to chapter 29, which most people don't really like reading and find exceptionally boring, it essentially deals with a whole series of sacrifices that were brought during a 7-day period when Aaron and his sons were inducted into the priesthood. And you could see this if you look at the end of, let me just find this. It's not the end. It's chapter 29, verse 35. After it gives me this whole, as I said, series of sacrifices and different services that have to be done, it says in chapter 29, verse 35, and vasita la'aron u'levanav kacha, you should do thus to Aaron and his sons, kechol asher tziviti otacha, according to all that I commanded you, shiv'at yamim t'malei yadam, for 7 days you should fill their hands. And so whatever's described in this chapter is the tabernacle service, which Aaron and his sons did for a period of 7 days. This period of 7 days in Hebrew is known as Shiv'at Yemei HaMiluim. The 7 days in modern Hebrew, you'd say reserve duty, but it's not reserve duty. It's to fill their hands. Essentially, it's 7 days where they're practicing all the different types of sacrifices that will eventually be done in the tabernacle, so that when the tabernacle opens up, day one of the tabernacle, they will be ready to actually go in full gear in the service. And for those of you who are not aware of this, so the temple began functioning on the first day of the month of Nisan, approximately a year after the Jewish people left Egypt. And that we see at in chapter 40 in the book of Shemot, which we will eventually talk about. Not today, but in another few weeks. Now that's what we have in chapter 29. Chapter 30 discusses the incense altar. And one might say not only excuse me, I skipped something. The end of chapter 29, which is from verse 38 through 46, the end of chapter 29, speaks about the daily sacrifices which were brought, 2 daily offerings on behalf of the community, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. This is known as the Korban Tamid. Okay, the daily / consistent sacrifice offering that's brought. Okay, now chapter 30 speaks about the incense altar. And it also speaks a little bit about the offering of the incense. And essentially, that's how we end the Parsha. Okay, so this is the general outline of what we have. And what I tried to show you is, it's not only that we talk about the priestly garments, we talk about the lighting of the menorah, we talk about the incense and the incense altar, we talk about the daily sacrifices, and we also talk about all of the different sacrifices that were brought during the 7-day, what you might call training period of Aaron and his sons, before the tabernacle is established and is off and running and functioning, which is on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Okay, I hope that whatever I've said up to this point is clear to everybody. Okay, because so as we go along now, it might get a little confusing, which I will try not to do. So what I would like to do, actually, this was just a kind of introduction. I'd like to now speak about something which always fascinates me, and that is, the name of the Parsha and why the rabbis chose that name. And what also I find interesting very often is when you have 2 parshiot that seem to have similar names. And then the question becomes, to what extent are they connected? So, for example, we actually spoke about this. In the book of Breshit, you have Parshat Chayei Sarah, and then you have the end of the book, which is Parshat Vayechi, where both the title of the Parsha has to do with life, but in fact, there are 2 parshiot that speak about death. In one case, the death of Sarah, in the other case, the death of Yaakov. And what's very interesting is that what the 2 of them share in common has to do with essentially the burial place. Sarah is buried in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, and Jacob insists on being buried in the same place, even though that's a much more complicated endeavor since he has to be transported from Egypt to Israel. So why am I bringing this up? Because our Parsha is Parshat Tetzaveh, and in the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, the second Parsha is Parshat Tzav. And Tetzaveh means commanded. Tzav means command. Okay, so then the question is beyond just, the names that are identical or similar, is the content similar? And in fact, the content is similar. And what I just want to point out is in our Parsha, I spoke to you about how we're given the instructions for the priestly garments. And if you look at the end of the section of the priestly garments, let me just find it for 1 second. Okay, this is in chapter 28, verse 40. After it lists all the priestly garments, it says, I'm sorry, actually it's 41. V'hilbashta otam et Aharon achicha, and you will then clothe Aaron and his sons, ve'et banav ito, umashachta otam, and you will anoint them, umileita et yadam, you will fill their hands, v'kidashta otam v'chihanuli, and you will sanctify them, and they will be priests to me. So if you could keep your finger in this place, and now what I'd like you to do is turn to Leviticus chapter 8. And if you look at chapter 8, verse 2, God says to Moshe, take Aaron and his sons with you, and the clothing, and the anointing oil, and this bull offering, and the 2 rams. And then it says in verse 6, and Moses brought Aaron and his sons near, and he bathed them, and then he put on him the tunic, and then he put on the belt, and then he put on the cloak, and then he put on the ephod, which essentially means that in Parshat Tzav, we have the implementation of the instructions that are given in our Parsha, which means if in our Parsha, God says to Moshe, clothe Aaron with these garments, it actually happens in Parshat Tzav. And if you look at the continuation of chapter 8, the continuation of chapter 8 essentially is the implementation of chapter 29 by us. Which means if in chapter 29 by us, it speaks about all the sacrifices which are going to be brought during this 7-day training period, in chapter 8 in Leviticus, we actually have the description in real time of that training period. So therefore, I have 2 parshiot which are connected, and connected even by the title, which is Tetzaveh and Tzav. Okay, that's very nice. So now what I'd like to get to why is this important? So, what I would like to suggest is that our Parsha is not just talking about the priestly garments, but our Parsha, the focus of it, has to do with the institution of the priesthood, with the role of the priests. And Parshat Tzav is also the Parsha that has to do with the role of the priests. Whereas our Parsha is giving you this theoretical outline, in Parshat Tzav, it now becomes a reality, with the idea being that the priests are now invested in their role, so that afterwards in Parshat Shmini, they are now ready to start operating, to do the service in the temple. And this is what I would like to examine tonight, the nature of the role of the priests. Who are the priests? And what are they doing? And why is that important to us? And what I'd like to begin with is just to note that there are many, many details that are very, very technical and seem to be very foreign and alien, and one might even say off-putting. But I think that it's also very important, and that's what I'd like to do tonight, to be able to see that beyond those details, there are perhaps certain ideas which are extremely important. So before I actually get into some of the actual things which are mentioned in the Parsha, I'd like to actually talk about at the beginning what doesn't appear in the Parsha. And what's fascinating is that this is the only Parsha from the beginning of the book of Exodus until the end of the Torah, until the end of Deuteronomy, where Moshe's name is not mentioned. You can check this out. If you actually go through our whole Parsha, you'll see that Moshe's name is actually not mentioned. And this is a problem that bothers a number of commentaries, like, what's going on over here? And I'll just mention to you one comment by a commentary called the Baal HaTurim, Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, who lived in 1270 to 1340. And it's not a well-known commentary. This Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher is much more known for his halachic work called the Tur, which was a forerunner of the Shulchan Aruch. But he has a commentary on the Torah, and he raises that question. And his explanation is, well, you know, there's a verse which appears in next week's Parsha by the golden calf, when Moshe is essentially pleading the case of the Jewish people. And at a certain point, God says to Moshe, leave me alone, let me wipe out the Jewish people. And Moshe is really the defense attorney for the Jewish people, and is, as I said, pleading their case. And if you look at this verse, it's chapter 32, verse 32. Moshe says at a certain point to God, and now, if you forgive the Jewish people, and he doesn't say what, but presumably great. But then he says, but if you don't forgive the Jewish people, macheni na misifrecha asher katavta, erase me from the book which you've written. So this commentary, the Baal HaTurim, says that whenever someone says a curse, and even if it's conditional, on some level, if it's a righteous person, the curse comes true. And so Moshe said to God, okay, erase me from your book, and here it happened. In other words, here is God, who is not erasing Moshe totally from the book, but only from this one parsha. And he says this presumably also based on the assumption that maybe the sections are not in chronological sequence. And then what he says is, which is very interesting, he says, and why doesn't Moshe's name appear over here? Because it's sad. It's really very sad that here Moshe, he should have actually been the high priest. And in the end, for a variety of reasons, which I'm not going to go into right now, God gave the priesthood to Aaron. And so the absence of Moshe's name is like kind of expressing, it's like as if we empathize with Moshe's pain, okay, and having lost the priesthood. Okay, I have to say that I brought this commentary as a kind of straw man, as they say, because I have a completely different understanding of this. But I'm bringing it up because this is generally, if you were to ask anybody, right? And, if you actually bring this up in your shul and say, oh, by the way, did you know that this parsha is the only one, right, where Moshe's name is not mentioned? And then they would say, oh, yeah, sure, I know that. And I know the reason for it because, there's this verse in next week's parsha. So you'll know what they're talking about. But then you'll give them a better explanation, I think. And what's the explanation, which I think why Moshe's name doesn't appear? Because it really has to do with the core of what it means to be a priest. And that is, you're now taking on this leadership position, but it's a leadership position where the purpose is not to make a name for yourself. From beginning to end, the purpose of the leadership position is to serve God, to serve the Jewish people. And Moshe, who is the leader of the Jewish people, he now models that for Aaron as a way of saying, I am now inducting you into the priesthood. And as I do this, my name will not appear because it isn't about me. And it's important that you realize it's not about you. It's about serving God and about serving the Jewish people, which I think is the first point that is extremely important in this Parsha. What does it mean to be a priest? And one could perhaps extend that to being a leader in general. The purpose of leadership is to serve. And if someone is truly serving, then their name should not be there. That's not the point, to highlight my name. And now I want to point out something which is an anomaly, which is a kind of complement to what I just said now, complement with an E. If you look at the beginning of the Parsha, it says 3 times, Ve'ata. Look at the opening verse, Ve'ata tetzaveh b'nei Yisrael. And then the verse in chapter 28, the first verse, Ve'ata hakrei velecha. Right? God says, you command the Jewish people. You bring Aaron, your brother, near. Look at chapter 28, verse 3. Va'ata tedaber. And you speak to the Jewish people, to all those men, right, who are wise of heart. Now, this is very unusual because normally the way the Torah would say it is tzav, command without the and you command, or bring near without the you bring, or speak, daber, without va'ata tedaber. Now, clearly from the context and also from the previous Parsha, it's clear we know who you is. Obviously, you is Moshe. So what's the point of the Torah emphasizing and you, and you, and you? It's a way of saying that Moshe is playing a very active role in everything which is going on in this Parsha. It's not that Moshe is absent. Moshe is there. Moshe is in your face. None of what's going on in our Parsha could have possibly happened without Moshe. But it's not about making a name. Which means, and here again, I want to just round out this point, that if somebody's a leader, being a leader, you have the expectation of being very, very proactive. And you're expected to be doing and constantly doing. And not only that, but if you look at what we have in these 3 verses that I quoted to you, you're also somebody who should be you should be motivating other people to be doing things and get them involved. But none of it should have to do with making a name for yourself. Because ultimately, leadership is about service. And that is the message, the critical message to be given to Aaron. So that's the first point which I wanted to make. The second point, the name of the Parsha is Tetzaveh. And I showed you how you have this parallel Parsha, Parshat Tzav. And the word means commandment. And this also becomes an extremely important point in how we view the role of Aaron and his sons. So I'll put this out there, and I say this in advance. I hope that what I'm saying is not offensive and is going to, and because it's not meant to be. I mean, I'm being a little bit tongue in cheek, as they say. Service in the temple, in the tabernacle, there's no such thing as a creative service. It's not like, okay, here we are. I woke up today and we're going to start serving God by playing our guitar and, I don't know, doing all kinds of dances and everything else. And tomorrow we'll come up with some other idea of how we do it. Everything which is done in the tabernacle, in the temple, is clearly outlined and structured. There is absolutely no room for creativity in the service. The service is a given. And the role of Aaron and his sons is to simply follow the instructions which God tells them. Whether it be in terms of the different sacrifices that are brought, how they're to be brought, when they're to be brought, where they're to be brought. Everything is clearly outlined. Everything is commanded. And they simply have to follow the rules. One might say, well, so where is the creativity? And I'll speak about this much more later on. The creativity has to do with kavanah, the intentionality. What are they thinking? Excuse me. What are they thinking? How focused are they when they're doing the service? That's where they bring themselves to the service. And therefore, what you have over here is a combination of having a certain framework which is given, which is structured, and within that framework, to somehow bring yourself to it. And I think this is very, very interesting because I think if you look, and we'll maybe speak about this even more next week, okay, that actually maybe 2 weeks from now, if you look at musicians, artists, okay, very often, okay, and I would say that especially when you're talking about great musicians, great artists, there is definitely a structure which they are committed to. Maybe, in fact, what I should say is, yes, there's a structure which you're committed to. For example, right, I am a pianist. So I have a piece, right, which I'm about to play. That's a given, right? I'm playing this certain piece. But in the end, how I play it is a function of me, my soul, my kavanah. And that's what will make a difference. Two people will play the same piece. Two people could theoretically replicate the same work of art, but it would be radically different. Because there's something inside them which they bring to whatever they're doing, which then redefines, or maybe I shouldn't say redefines, defines the very nature of their act. And this becomes, as I said, for me to now go back, the core of what it is to be a priest. As a priest, you operate within a certain structure. You operate with the awareness. You're commanded. And now I want to maybe take this another step. In other words, it's not just that I have a structure, but I'm commanded. What does that mean? God is the king. I am the servant. What I am now doing is in service of God. It's not just a job, but it's a job which is reflecting something. And how much, as the Kohen, do you see that you are now the servant of God in what you're doing? How much do you understand what God is all about? And given that, what it takes to then serve God. Now, I want to bring up something which then will get me to my next point. A comment which actually appears in the Gemara in a number of different places, which when people first encounter it, they usually find it counterintuitive. There's a statement in the Talmud which says the following: Gadol ha-mitzuveh va'oseh mimi she'eno mitzuveh va'oseh, which means greater is the one who is commanded to do something and does it than the one who's not commanded to do something and does it. And generally, right, I would assume everybody here, right, when you hear that statement, you say, it doesn't make any sense. Because if I'm commanded to do something, so I'm doing it because I have to do it. But if I'm not commanded, it's voluntary. That's certainly a much more significant statement to do something of your own free will than to do it just because you have to do it. And so the rabbis also, understood that. And I'll offer you one explanation which will lead me into the next point about our Parsha. And that is the reason, an explanation which is given for why the one who's commanded is greater than the one who's not commanded, is because if somebody really has an awareness of what it means to be commanded, then they will be consistent. Then you can know that no matter what, they will do it. And they will do it on a consistent, regular basis. The one who's not commanded, they'll do it. And it could very well be that when they do it, right, it might be more meaningful. But it could be today they wake up and say, oh yeah, I'd like to do this. Tomorrow, I'd like to sleep in. And therefore, you lack the element of consistency. And I'd even say because it's also very hard for people to maintain the motivation if you don't have to do it. And I think that's true in many, many different frameworks. When you create a framework where people are committed to something and they have to do it, then that creates the sense of whatever the situation, whether I like it, whether I don't like it, I'm going to do it. And there's something which is very, very significant in consistency. And now I want to show you how this point actually, I think, becomes a central point in the Parsha. Remember, I said to you, if we look at the opening verses in the Parsha, we start off by talking about the lighting of the menorah. So let's look at chapter 27, verse 20. It says, V'ata tetzaveh b'nei Yisrael, and God says to Moshe, command the Jewish people, v'yikchu elecha, let them take to you shemen zayit zach, pure olive oil, katit, that's been beaten, lam ma'or, for light. And then it says, leha'alot ner tamid, to bring up an everlasting light, tamid. The Ohel Moed, in the tent of meeting, michutz laparochet, outside of the curtain, asher al ha'idut, which is on the testimony. Ya'aroch oto Aharon uvanav, Aaron and his son shall arrange it, meaning that they will arrange the lights, they will light the lights. May erev ad boker lifnei Hashem, from evening to morning before God. Chukat olam lidorotam, an everlasting statute for generations. Me'et b'nei Israel, from the Jewish people. So what I want you to see is that in the lighting of the candles, a point which is emphasized is this idea of tamid, forever. And then it says it a second time, from evening to morning, an everlasting statute for generations. Now look at the end of the Parsha. Look at chapter 29, verse 38. This is talking about the daily sacrifice. V'zeh asher ta'aseh al hamizbeach, kvasim b'nei shana shnayim layom tamid. This is what you offer up on the altar. 2 sheep a day, tamid. Tamid means forever. And then if you look a few sentences down, look at verse 42. Olat tamid lidorotechem. Right? A burnt offering forever for all generations at the entrance to the tent of meeting before God. Everybody see this? So once again, by the daily sacrifice, it speaks about the idea of tamid, something which is forever. And then I want to look at the third thing, chapter 30, the incense. Okay? In chapter 30, verse 7, it says, and Aaron will bring on the incense altar incense made of spices, baboker, baboker, morning by morning. Behetivot hanirot, when he cleans out the candles, yaktirena, he will offer the incense. And then it says, uvahalot aronet hanerot, and when Aaron lights the candles, bein ha'arbayim in the afternoon, yaktirena, he also will offer the incense. Ketoret tamid, an everlasting incense, lifnei Hashem, before God, lidorotechem, for all generations. So what do I want to show you? I want to show you, you have 3 different types of service that are being described in our Parsha: the lighting of the menorah, the daily sacrifice, and the incense. And by all 3, it emphasizes the idea of tamid, forever, for all generations. And by the way, which I'll come back to in a few moments, note the fact that there seems to be a linkage over here between the lighting of the menorah and the incense. Because when do you offer the incense? When you're cleaning out the menorah in the morning, and then after you're lighting it in the afternoon. So it's also very interesting that the Parsha begins with the lighting of the menorah. It ends with the incense, but when it ends with the incense, it's telling you that it's like the bookends. The incense and the menorah are very much interconnected. So now, what's the idea of tamid? And I'm now going to give you a quote from Rashi, which is very interesting, that Rashi says this in the context of tzav, right? Commandment, Tetzaveh. And this is based on a rabbinic comment from the Gemara. It says, whenever the word tzav appears, it means miyad, immediately, uledorot, and forever. And so what I would like to now go into is this idea of commandment and what I would call time consciousness. And this, I think, becomes a very important idea by the priests. I think in the context of the classes I've been giving, and I get mixed up usually between which class I'm giving where, but I think in the context of these sessions we've had, that I think I've had the opportunity to mention that time consciousness is very much at the core of what it means to be a human being. And I would even say to be a free human being, a dignified human being. Right? The very first thing that we have in the Torah is creating a structure of time, 7 days of creation. Even the whole idea of Bereshit, having a beginning, okay? So time is the most fundamental structure for us. And in chapter 12 in the book of Exodus, before the Jewish people leave Egypt, the first mitzvot which they're given have to do with structuring their time. And it has to do with the idea of sanctifying the new moon, and then all the things that revolve around the Paschal Lamb. And it's as if, in other words, this idea of time consciousness is absolutely critical to their freedom and to what it means to be free. So what I'd like to do is now look at this in the context of the priests. Because we said tzav, miyad uledorot. So I'll start with miyad. There's a concept which appears in the Talmud in a number of different places where it says kohanim, that the priests zrizinhem. They're very diligent. Zion resh yud Zion, for those who want the Hebrew. They're diligent. And what does that mean? That means the priests, when they have to do the temple service, they don't just lounge around, but they're on the go, okay? And they do things quickly. I would also add methodically. I would also add carefully, but they're quick. And that concept is what I think the rabbis are saying when they say, tzav miyad. If something is a commandment, and if you take seriously the fact that this is a commandment, then you do it immediately. If the king orders something, you don't just sit around, but the king expects things to get done immediately. And by the way, I think this raises a very interesting question in general, when you talk about people doing mitzvot. How much do people really know, okay, I get up in the morning, right? Oh, there's this mitzvah of davening. Oh, but before I daven, I got to have my coffee. I read the newspaper, okay? But davening, you're serving God. The first thing you do in the morning, right? Moda'ani, I thank you, God. I recognize you. I want to now show you, I worship you. So how much are people jumping out of bed and the first thing which they do is, let me get out and start praying? Or how much is it I have to, put on the snooze, and then afterwards I have to have my coffee and I have to, putter around a little bit. So what I would say, right, and again, I'm not saying this to be offensive to anyone, is that, but doing that means you have no concept of what it means to be commanded. You have no concept of what it means that what you're about to do is service of God. Because if you took seriously this is service of God, you wouldn't play around. You would be jumping at that. And that's what's expected of the priests. The moment the priests are on duty, then they're there. And they have to be focused. And they have to be moving. Which means, and they have to realize, if you're now in service, that means that you maximize every moment that you have. And this is, in a certain sense, the most intense expression of time consciousness. It's the awareness that every moment is absolutely critical, and let me make the most of every moment. And if I'm now in service of God, then let me get the most done that I can possibly do. And by the way, this has ramifications in general, which is, how much do we actually maximize the usage of our time? And by the way, you could translate this in the workplace. How much do people actually, maximize the usage of their time when they're working? Or how much is it that people take coffee breaks and they take bathroom breaks and then they schmooze, and then so that the net amount of work is, rather than being 8 hours, is maybe 4 hours or sometimes 2 hours, okay? Well, what about a work ethic? Well, how much do you feel commanded or committed to a work ethic? And how much also do you feel committed, in a certain sense, to maximizing your potential? So that's what I want to say in terms of the priests, that the priests, by being commanded, have the sense that every moment is critical and they are in service of God and they have to do it quickly and maximize, right, their output, so to speak. But then they also have another awareness, which is Lidorot. And Lidorot means the realization that what they're doing is not just, every day doing the same thing all over again, but they are part of a continuum of something which is meant to be forever. They're part of a chain of priests. It didn't begin with them and it's not going to end with them. And so therefore, what I would like to say is, and this is ultimately what it means, tamid. Tamid, forever, can be reflected in two ways. One way of something being forever is by the consistency, day in, day out, regularity. And I might even add not just regularity, alacrity. But then there's another idea of seeing that what I'm doing is not just I'm doing it every single day, but this is something which actually is forever, for all generations. It goes beyond me. It didn't begin with me. It didn't end with me, which means that somebody who's a priest sees themselves as being part of a much larger continuum. In fact, you could even say this, which is, although they operate within the context, within the constraints of time, in a certain sense, what they're doing goes beyond time because it's meant to be forever. It's not just for this moment, which means it's a very interesting kind of dialectic of time consciousness. Because on the one hand, what I'm doing is utilizing every moment which I have and maximizing it. I am also being consistent in doing this day in, day out. And I'm also able to see how this is something which ultimately is forever, which is not for any limited amount of time, but which in a way goes beyond time. So this is the role of the priests. And as I said, you could extend this to any type of leadership position or maybe to any situation in life, which is to what extent is it that I look at what I'm doing and realizing that every moment is precious and let me not waste it? To what extent is it that I maintain a consistency in the things that I do? And to what extent is it that the things that I do, I see as being important far beyond me, forever? And maybe that's why it's also important to be consistently and constantly doing this, as a way of not letting it lose steam, as a way of seeing that it will always continue forever. So now let me move on to the idea of lighting the menorah, which appears in the beginning of the Parsha, and the incense, which appears at the end of the Parsha. So the first thing which I would like to begin with in terms of that is there's a pasuk, which I'm sure people are familiar with, which says, Kiner mitzvah v'torah or, that a commandment is like a candle, and Torah is like light, and Torah is light, which sees light as a kind of metaphor for Torah, or maybe Torah being the ultimate expression of what light is. And so therefore you have quite a few commentaries who say that the lighting of the menorah is very much connected with the idea of Torah. And I'll just mention one commentary, the Netziv, who I've mentioned on other occasions, who says, well, the Ark, which is in the Holy of Holies, has the has the tablets. That's Torah. So what about the menorah? You're saying, well, that's an expression. So the explanation is, well, the tablets which in the Ark reflect the written Torah, or one might say the revealed Torah, the Torah of God, which God revealed to us, but which essentially is in the Holy of Holies, okay? And it's just sitting there. The menorah, he sees, as referring to the oral law. The menorah is facing the Ark. It's drawing its inspiration from the Ark, but it's our engagement with what's in the ark, which means the ark has the word of God. But the point of the word of God was for us to then engage it and to then develop it. And that's the menorah. And the menorah needs to be lit. It needs to be lit every day. And to a certain extent, what this is then reflecting is the role of the priests as educators, as teachers, and perhaps first and foremost for themselves, that they need to be learned. And I would even say they need to always be trying to understand better what it is they're doing, why they're doing it, what are they hoping to accomplish with it, so that there is a need to be constantly learning and developing and understanding. And for those of you who stayed with me last week at the end of this year, when I was speaking about the idea, actually this was 2 weeks ago. Okay, so that's even more. 2 weeks ago when I was speaking about, the covenant at Sinai, and I mentioned to you this idea of Na'aseh v'nishma. And I said, when the Jews said Na'aseh v'nishma, they said, we'll do. But what does v'nishma mean? And we will understand. But, well, how do you understand after you do? But the answer is, yes, you do understand. Because it could be there are a lot of things that you do, but you don't necessarily fully understand. Or even if you think you understand them, there may be much more that you could learn about it. And therefore, so the idea is, it's not just that I do, but I'm constantly trying to understand what I'm doing, because there's always much more to learn. And there's never a point where I fully understand it. And that's why the beginning of our Parsha, before we start talking about the role of the priests, or maybe I should say, perhaps, I think I mentioned this last week. Okay, a little bit. Last week it was relevant. Last week when we were talking about the utensils that were built, I mentioned to you that the first utensil which is mentioned is the ark. Why? Because the ark is the most significant. Because it's in the Holy of Holies. It's where the 2 tablets are. It's where we have the testimony to the revelation at Sinai, where God even speaks to Moshe. So in our Parsha, if the first thing that we speak about in terms of the priests is the lighting of the menorah, then maybe what that's highlighting is that the most basic role of the priests is to be studying, to be teaching. And not only that, I would even now add, if their service is going to be meaningful, it's only going to be meaningful if it's informed, if they find meaning in the things that they're doing. And that's why it's important for them to be lighting that menorah every single day, as a way of saying to themselves, every single day, they need to be learning, they need to be growing. If I now jump to the end of the Parsha, which is the incense, what is the significance of the incense? Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, in his commentary, and I was reading this a few times, and I read it, and I'll tell you what he says, and I'll tell you maybe what I think. I don't know if this is what he meant, but he says that the idea of the incense has to do with service of God, which is purely spiritual, which is refined, which is so elevated. It's, in a certain sense, he doesn't use this language, but I'll use it. It's like the ultimate service of God. So for the moment, if I look at the menorah at the beginning and the incense at the end, the menorah is talking about study, intellectual. The incense is talking about service, which is experiential. Now, the way that I try to understand Rabbi Hirsch is the idea of doing something which is a complete spiritual act. Or maybe I'll phrase this in the following, which has total kavanah, total intentionality. And so this is how we end the Parsha. It begins with study, but it ends with action, an action which is complete, which is totally intentional. And therefore, and then just before the incense, what does it talk about? The sacrifices, the daily sacrifice, right? Cutting up animals, sprinkling blood, burning the animal on the altar. Now, what I would like to just say with the incense, and I have a few more points, you'll give me 5 more minutes, is that we all know that there's a certain problem that when you have things which are very structured, and I kept on pushing the idea of the importance of being commanded and of consistency and of regularity, but everybody knows that you have the pitfall that when things become very, very consistent and very regular, they become routine. And when they become routine, they lose their meaning. So what I would like to suggest as a way of explaining our Parsha is that the Parsha begins with the lighting of the Menorah that has to do with study. It ends with the incense. As a way of saying, if you're working in a framework of routine and consistency, if you don't want it to degenerate and you don't want it to become something which is void of meaning, the way for that to happen is to be constantly learning, constantly understanding. And the integration of the actions with the understanding can then create an act which is fully intentional, which is what the Torah is symbolizing. And that's the goal of the priests. So it's on the one hand to be commanded, it's on the other hand to be consistent, to be doing things with understanding, and the ultimate goal is for them to be able to be constantly doing fully intentional, fully meaningful acts. So it's not just that we go through the motions, but that in fact, and now I want to suggest another thing, the Torah in rabbinic literature is always seen as the ultimate service of God. And what I would say is, because the Torah in many ways, the meaning behind it is, it's the ultimate expression of an I vow encounter, where it isn't just that I'm doing something, right, as an act in service of God, but it goes far beyond that. The act becomes the means by which I have this intimate I vow relationship with God. And that's the point of the Torah. But the idea of the Torah is it doesn't just happen. You have to make it happen. And in order to be able to come to that point, you need, on the one hand, as I said, the consistency, and on the other hand, the understanding. And the more that those two actions become fused together, the more that they can then lead to a very profound I vow encounter. And that is the role of the priests. And that is, if it's happening, what will make the temple a vibrant model, as we discussed last week, which can then impact on the Jewish people in their day-to-day lives and become a model, an inspiration for what their daily lives should be. By the way, I would also like to bring up one comment connected with this, which is very interesting, that appears in a few sources. It's actually the root of it is in a Midrash Tanchuma, which says that, in other words, the lighting of the menorah and the incense both have to do with also joy and elevation. And I think it's actually very, very interesting because, it's first of all, it's interesting, this idea of, how light can bring a smile to your face, right? I mean, without getting, this could be a whole discussion in itself, right? About, how darkness is associated with melancholy and it's just, a downer. But, when things are light, it's like you see the sunshine and you have a smile on your face. And by the same token, with the incense, right? Although I haven't had the experience, but I imagine for some people who've tried out some drugs, the way they describe it is that they're on a high and they're, and it's, they're floating in air. So I'm just saying it's very interesting that, in other words, these two things also create a certain, what I would call upbeatness, and not only upbeatness, but this real love and passion for life, which is essentially, by the way, what the essence of the Mishkan is. Because the Mishkan is the home of God, where God is the embodiment of life. So that, in fact, the Mishkan should be something that energizes you, that really fills you with this, with this tremendous fervor. And as I said, love of life. Now, I'm just going to end with making one comment. The rest will be commentary for maybe another time. And that is, I can't, not say this. If you were to actually look at certain verses in Megillat Esther and compare them with this week's Parsha, our Parsha, and also last week's Parsha, you'll see some very interesting similarities. In fact, if you look at chapter 1, you'll see that for example, by the priestly garments, which I didn't look at in our Parsha, it speaks about the garments are supposed to be lichavod uletif'aret, for honor and for splendor. And if you actually look at the beginning of Megillat Esther, Achashverosh is trying to show off his honor and his splendor. There are these elaborate descriptions of his palace, of the tapestries, of the silver, the gold, and even more than that. If I wanted to push this even more, right? And we talk about, the incense and the oil and everything else that are used to sanctify Aaron, that are used to, sanctify the utensils that are used to serve God. Well, if you read chapter 2 in the Megillah, you'll see all these oils and spices that are basically used, for all the women that are now going to be prepared for their one-night stand with Achashverosh. Now, what do I want to say with all this? Everything which is described in Megillat Esther is the polar opposite of what we have in our Parshiot. It's the anti-Mishkan, the anti-divine presence. It's a framework which is the total inverse, or as it says in the Megillah, v'nahafochu. It's the opposite. It's something which has been turned on its head. And this is what I would like to end with. If our Parsha is talking about the role of the priests, if our Parsha is talking about people who have a profound sense of service, who are not out to make a name for themselves, who see a higher picture, who are looking for holiness, for transcendence, and are looking to lift up everything around them, which I discussed last week also, who through what they're doing experience this real engagement with life and affirmation of life and love of life. When you read the Megillah, you see you're talking about a framework which is the total opposite. Where in the Megillah, Everybody's out to make a name for themselves. Any concept of service, okay, except for what ends up happening with Mordechai and Esther, who see what they're doing is ultimately being for the good of the Jewish people, but Achashverosh, all the people around them, for everybody, it's about making a name. For everybody, it's not about highlighting life. If anything, life doesn't mean anything. How quick are you to, okay, immediately make a decree that will kill people or to even encourage killing of people? How is it that you take people and then objectify them? In the same way that Achashverosh shows off his utensils, he wants to show off his wife. And then he gathers all the virgins and puts them in oil to basically get them ready. For what? For a one-night stand with Achashverosh? Is there anything in the Megillah which has any sense of permanence, of consistency? Everything is arbitrary. Everything is focused around the here and now. So something for you to think about is how the Megillah is describing a reality which is the polar opposite, the total inversion of everything we have in our Parshiot. And I'll therefore end with something which I mentioned a while ago, and again, something to think about. When I first started the book of Shemot, I said Nachmanides describes the book of Shemot as the book of exile and redemption. And I mentioned to you at the time that the redemption happens at Mount Sinai and then reaches its peak with the construction of the tabernacle, where the presence of God is manifest. Megillat Esther is the ultimate expression of exile, the polar opposite, a framework where ostensibly God is totally absent, where there is no sense of any correlation between what is happening and what should be happening, and where rather than leading the world to a place which is uplifting, it's essentially leading the world to a place of total chaos. Food for thought. Happy Purim, everyone. And